All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me. We're going to get started on this simple landing page project. So if you're joining me, I'm assuming you're coming from a relatively beginner background and you're just here to have some fun. So before we dive in, I'm just going to show you what we'll be building, and also we'll get our project set up. So this is just a visual of what we're going to be building today, just a very basic landing page, typically something you could see on any marketing web page or any website with your call to action here. And so hoping that you guys have some fun with this. It doesn't have to be exactly as I have it here, but basically this is just to demonstrate some basic concepts in HTML and CSS to get you started. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to actually start in our command line or terminal. So for those of you who are working from your local machines, you should have a built-in terminal. And if you go into your main search, you can just look up your terminal and it should pop up with something similar to this. So I'm going to open this up. And the first command we're going to run is we're going to run a command that's going to create our working directory. So in this case, we would run the following command, which is short for make directory. And this will be, we can call it anything, but I'll just call it simple landing page. And once you press enter, you should see something along the lines of this. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to cd into our newly created directory. So that stands for change directory. And then we're going to type out the name of our newly created directory. So simple landing page. And then you notice here that we're now in that directory. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first file. So this file is going to be created using the touch command. So we're going to go touch and then the name of the file that we want to create. So in this case, we'll just keep it basic. It'll be index.html. Once you press enter, that actually creates the file within your working directory, although you won't see it right away. And then the next thing we do is we're going to actually open our code editor right from our command line. So in this case, I'm using Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to run the following command, which will be code space dot. And when we press enter, our code editor will open with our current directory already there for us. So I'm going to go into my index.html file. Now, one quick thing I do want to point out is that if you are working within Visual Studio Code, you do have the option of adding various extensions to your code editor to make your code life a little easier. One extension that I would definitely recommend if you're getting started with HTML is to add the HTML Boilerplate extension. And to add an extension, you can actually go down here, and when you hover, it'll tell you it's extensions. And when you click, it'll open up a search bar. So in this case, I would search HTML Boilerplate, which is down here. Now, it doesn't give me the option to install because I've already got it installed on my machine, but if you do wish to have it installed on yours, you would just simply install. And then we're going to go back to our project. So for those of you who may already have it installed, you can just type HTML, and then you'll see here it actually auto-populates it for me. So I'm going to select that. And it basically gives you your HTML starter or boilerplate code, which is great. It saves you from having to code a bunch of lines prior to getting started. And the first thing I'm going to do now that I have this is I'm actually going to get rid of all these comments that we don't really need. So I'm going to get rid of that as well. And I'm going to also get rid of that. And then we'll just delete the extra lines. And since we're not using JavaScript in this project at all, we can get rid of our script tags as well. All right, so for those of you who don't have any sort of extension like a boilerplate extension installed, you can actually pause this video and just copy line by line what I have here just to follow along. For those of you who already have this set up and are ready to go, we'll just continue right into the next part of this tutorial. So on line 6 here, I've got a pair of title tags. Within those title tags, I'm actually going to just create a title for this project called we'll call this simple landing page, and I'll save that. And in case you want to see where that ends up, actually I haven't opened it yet. So what we can do is we can right click and open that in our browser. So I'm using Chrome, so I'm just going to open that up. and it ends up in our tab. So that's the title of our website. Nothing really going on here just yet, but just to show you where that ends up when you declare a title in your HTML web page. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to add a div within our body tags. So if you go in between your body tags here and you just give yourself an extra line, you can create a div. Now, if you have the Emmet extension installed on your code editor, I believe Atom has something similar. If you're using Atom, you can just press tab, and then that'll give you a pair of opening and closing div tags, and you can give yourself an extra line for that. And within those div tags, we're actually going to create our main header, which is going to be done using an H2 tag. And within that H2, I'm just going to copy verbatim what I had in the demo. So you can make this anything you want, but I'm going to be just working along the same lines as the demo. So once you save that, we're going to go over to our web page and we're going to quickly refresh. And you'll notice here that the H2 displays nicely for you in the top left-hand corner of your screen. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add an H2, or sorry, not an H2, an H5. And for those of you who are familiar with HTML code, you'll notice that the H5 header tag is smaller than the H2 header tags by default. So this will make our subtitle or a subheader. And within that subheader, I already had a subheader here, so I'm just going to add that into this new project. But if you want to create your own subheader text, or if you just want to use lorem ipsum text, that's entirely up to you. We're being optimists today. And that is our subheader text. So now that we've saved that, we can refresh and we see it display nicely underneath our main header. So now that we have our headers set up, we can go underneath our H5 and we're going to add an anchor tag. Anchor tags are what we use for links. So you'll just do that by typing an A, and then you can tab over. And in between the opening and closing anchor tags, where I have my cursor right now, I'm just going to add the following text, which will be learn more. This will be our call to action. And once we get that set up, we can actually go back into our browser, and we'll notice here that we now have a link. It goes absolutely nowhere, but it's always nice to see it. So this is the basic structure of our HTML page so far. If you've gotten this far, bravo. We've done just a few simple things to get our structure going, but we're not near done just yet. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back into our HTML project, and we're going to now add some class selectors into our tags so that we can use those classes to style the elements within our HTML page. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our div up here. We're going to get ourselves a space, and then we're going to call that a class. We're going to give that a class name of container. The next thing we'll do is we'll go into our H2, and we'll give that H2 an ID of main header, so main dash header. We'll give our H5 an ID of, subheader, so sub dash header. And then we will give our anchor tag here, we'll give that a class of button. So just BTN, like that. So what we've done now is we have started the setup for our HTML page to be friendly with our CSS style sheet that we haven't actually created just yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our working space here. If you're in Visual Studio Code, you can simply use this icon up here to add a new file, or you can right click and create a new file. And this new file we're going to call main.css, and we're just going to press enter. So this is our blank style sheet. We haven't done anything here yet. The first thing you want to do before you set anything up in your styles is you want to make sure that your styles will be applied to your CSS. You want to make sure your styles will be applied to your HTML. And the great thing about our boilerplate here is that it's already kind of set that up for us. So within this link tag, we'll see here that it has this rel, which basically gives us it's a style sheet. It's naming a style sheet. So this link is connecting to a style sheet. You don't have to know too much detail about some of the attributes that are named within the head tags, but just kind of have a basic understanding of what they're there for. Within this href is where we're actually going to declare the path to our CSS file. So when I click there and I type my M, I actually, because of the emit extension that I have in my Visual Studio Code, it actually defaults and gives me the main.css file. So I'm going to click that. Now, what we need to do is that in order to tell our project, in a sense, to jump out of this file, we need to place a dot and then a slash, which then points to the file that we want it to go and fetch for us. So in this case, our /main CSS completes the connection between our HTML page and our CSS style sheet. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our CSS style sheet and we're going to start declaring some styles. So before we do kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the styling, HTML typically comes with, before I do that, I'm actually going to save this and we'll go back in there. So HTML comes with default styling, which can either be what you want or maybe what you don't want. So in this case, we're going to actually select our entire HTML page and we're going to give it some of our own default styles. So we do that by setting an asterisk, which basically says that it wants to take everything within the HTML tags and give it these default styles before you even set anything with your other styles. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to select your curly braces and you're going to give yourself an extra line. We're going to set a margin, an overall margin of 5 pixels. And then we're going to set overall padding of 0. And this just gives us our own slate. If you do prefer this, you can definitely add it, but you don't have to. It's not necessary to the project as a whole, but usually, you know, when you're creating your own project and you like to have a bit more control over your working slate, this gives you the ability to do that. So we're going to go into our browser and I'm actually going to refresh, and you kind of see how those styles have changed here, just very slightly. So the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to go into our, we're going to select our container class. So the way we select a class in CSS is we use dot notation in this case. So we use a dot and then the name of our class, which is container in this case. So if I go back into my HTML file, you'll see here that that's what I called it. So I'm just going along ahead with the same naming there. So after the container, we're going to use curly braces once again. We're going to give ourselves an extra line and we're going to set a background image. So this background image is going to be an image that I actually already downloaded. So I'm going to take that from my local machine here. So from my local directory. And I'm just going to, within Visual Studio Code, if you've downloaded an image for yourself, you can do the same thing. So in here, I've already selected an image that I wanted to use, which is going to be this one. I'm actually going to make sure that ends up within my working directory. Kind of had it in the wrong place there. Okay, so this is the image that I'm selecting for my background image. If you are looking for an image to use for your background image, the stock image site that I typically use for projects such as these is unsplash.com. So here you can actually select very high quality images. You can search for specific types of images. The resolution is really good, and it's a bunch of photographers who've donated their work for the use of people like us who want to just kind of practice our coding skills, create projects, create websites. So there's a lot of variety here, which I like. So if you want to customize your project to your liking, you can select any one of these images here, or search for one as well. So I'm using this image for my project, and you can search for something similar. I believe in Unsplash I searched for something along the lines of adventure or travel, and it kind of came up with this, and I liked the quality of it, so I used it. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to, I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to just copy the relative path. And within my CSS, I'm actually going to go in and declare my background image. And the background image starts with a URL. And within that URL, you're going to give yourself a pair of quotations. And then I'm going to paste the relative path, which is essentially just the file name. Now, because the file and the CSS style sheet that we're working with are two separate things, we need to declare that we first have to jump out of this file and then jump into the image file. So that is the way in which we write that. And then at the end of our statement, we have to make sure we finish that with a semicolon. I think I accidentally copied something in there. And this too. Just gonna erase that. I tend to accidentally paste things with my keyboard. So now what we've done is we've added our background image here. And the next thing we want to make sure of is, did that render correctly? So notice here how the background image is not fully displaying within our web page. But what we do get to see here is that our style sheet and everything has been set up properly, and it has been connected to our HTML file, and all of that seems to be working. You can tell by the change to our browser when we add our background image. The only thing right now is that the background image is only going to display as much height as we've allowed. And in this case, since we only have 3 lines of code here, our height is very limited. So in order to make sure that that height is extended just a bit, we're going to add a few extra styles to our container. So underneath our background image, we're going to now add a background size. And our background size is going to have the value of cover. Our background position will have the value of top. And these are CSS values and properties that you can, of course, look up on your own to see what they do. You can play around with them as well to kind of get a better understanding on a more visual basis as to what these things are for. But I'm just going to kind of go through it. And if on your own time you wish to do that, feel free. There's plenty of resources online that'll clear some of these up for you. And underneath the position, we're going to add a height. This height will then allow us to see more of that background image. So this height will be 850 pixels, and we'll leave it at that for now. So once we've set a few of those properties, we can refresh, and we'll get to see more of our beautiful background image here. So 850 pixels just basically means that our image is going to stop here. But if you do want the image to take up the full background, we can of course do that if we choose. So all we got to do is change the value of our height, and we can, I'll add 100 to that. So make that 950, and then I'll save that, and then we can refresh. So notice here how now it pretty much takes up the full view of our browser. And notice here how our default margins are now set up, and our default padding is also set up. Remember how we set a default padding of 0 and default margins of 5 pixels. Now we're starting to see what that looks like. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take this back to 850, because what I want to do is I want to actually set it up so that it looks like the demo. And the demo here actually has this beautiful clip path on the bottom, shaped like a chevron. So I'm going to be doing that, but if you choose to leave it as a full background, you can of course do that. So in CSS, there is a property by the name of clip path, And it's a very, I really like it because it allows you to use geometric shapes to sort of set the shapes of your backgrounds. I think it's really cool. So we're going to use that. And in this case, we're going to use the Polygon feature of the clip path property. And since polygons, if you go back to geometry class, we know that polygons have, typically more than one side. So in this case, we're going to, this is going to be a 5-sided shape. And inside of those brackets, we're going to set our 5 sides. So the first side will be a 0, 0. And the next side will be 100% and then 0. And then the next side will be 100% and then 50%. Then our fourth side will be 50% and 100%. And then after that, we'll have a 0 and a 50%. Now, you can play with these values if you choose. They're not set in stone. I kind of played around before this tutorial, so that's why I have these set the way they are. And we're going to end our statement with a semicolon. So when we save that, we can go into our actual project. And when we refresh, that's where we get our beautiful clip path here. And we're almost on our way to making this look the way we have it in the demo. So in our CSS, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set a color overlay on our background. Notice here between the difference between the current project we're working on and the demo project, there's kind of like a, oh, I think I got rid of that by accident. Just quickly get that. So notice here how we have our demo project that's got a nice overlay. Purple's my favorite color, so that's why I chose a nice little purple gradient. So we're going to be doing the same thing with this landing page here. So inside of our project, what we're going to do is we're going to go back up to our background image property, and we're going to set what is called a linear gradient. So I'm going to give myself just one little bit of space there. We're going to go linear dash gradient, and our linear gradient is going to have a set of brackets, and inside of those brackets we're going to first set the direction of our gradient. So we have options to set it to bottom or to top, to right, to left, stuff like that. So I'm going to go to top, and then the next thing we're going to do is set our colors. Now we have the option of setting colors using hex codes. We can use the web safe basic color properties, or we can also use RGBA values. So in this case, I'm going to use RGBA values. And the reason is because the A allows us to set an opacity within the color. You'll get a chance to see this as we set our colors. So the first RGBA color value that we're going to use, and again, I kind of did my own sort of playing around before the tutorial. So I have these numbers set already. I'm not just pulling colors out of my head. So the last A value represents the opacity. I'm just going to give this an opacity of 0.62 or 62%. And then the second color, I'm going to set another RGBA, and this is going to be the following. And then we're going to save that. So now we should have our direction of the gradient, our two colors that are in the gradient, and then our URL for the background image. And before we do go and see what that looks like, we just have to add a comma there. And that should hopefully work. So I'm going to just have a look, see what we get. Oh, and our background image has disappeared. I think I may have made a typo here. Oh, there we go. I'm missing a comma here. So now that we've saved that, we get everything going. And when we refresh, you'll notice here now we have things coming along. So in our demo, we'll see the color is the same. In our project, the color is the same. So now we kind of have our background set up the way we want, but now we want to make sure that our text is following along the same lines. So the first thing we're going to do now is, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to now move out of our container, and we're going to now start styling our main header. So again, in our HTML, we set up an ID of main header. So notice here how we did that. We're just going to basically take this. You could easily just copy and paste this. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to move into our CSS. Now, the way we select IDs in CSS is slightly different from how we select classes in CSS. Notice here how we use the dot and then the name of our class. In this case, we're actually going to use the hash symbol or hashtag, and then we're going to place the name of our selector here, which is main header, and then we're going to place curly braces, and everything else kind of stays the same. But you want to make sure you use the correct syntax, otherwise you are going to get some errors. You're not going to fully see what it is you're trying to see. So within the curly braces, our following styles are going to be for the text. So the first thing will be our color. And our color in this case is going to be white. Now you can use white just like that, or you can also use the hex code if you wish, which is basically a hash symbol, first we start off with quotations, a hash, and then 3 Fs like that. And then that will give you your color. Oh, I think I actually may have done the incorrect syntax there. So the hex code in this case is just the triple F with your hash, or it can be 6 Fs as well. So that was my mistake. So at the end of that statement, then you would just place your semicolon, and then in here, you would refresh that, and then notice how your text changes to white. So we're actually going to do the same for both the main header and subheader, but we'll start with the main header for now. And underneath the color of our text, the next thing we're going to do is set our padding. So our padding, we're set a property of padding top, and our padding top is going to be 180 pixels. We're going to save that. And then the next thing we'll set is our font size. And our font size will be a value of 4 rem. Now, for those who are not familiar with rem values, you can translate them between pixel values. So you can translate between pixel and rem values. I believe 1 rem is 16 pixels. So if you do decide you prefer pixels, you can set this to the equivalent in pixels. But I prefer rems in this case, just because we're dealing with typography. That's what I'm used to. So at the end of that statement, we're going to add our semicolon. We can't forget that. And then underneath, we're going to make it a text align. And the text align in this case is going to be center. And then we're going to save that. So once you have all those properties defined within your style sheet, you can refresh this and see what happens. So now we have a lovely centered main header on our web page, but we still need to allow these other guys to join the show. So we're going to go into our style sheet, and we're going to go to the next property of styling, which is going to be our subheader. And again, just going back to our HTML our HTML file, our subheader is here. So I'm just going to copy that, and notice we set it as an ID. So you cannot forget that. If you do use the wrong syntax for selecting your ID within the style sheet, it won't work. So in the CSS file, we're going to go underneath our main header. We're going to use the same hash symbol because, again, we're working with IDs. And then we're going to paste that, and I'm going to use my curly braces. And within those curly braces, we're going to start our styling. So our color in this case is going to be white again. So once again, you can use the white. In this case, I like to use hex code, so I'm going to use a triple F for that. And underneath that, we're going to continue with a font size of 1.5 rem in this case, slightly smaller than, or quite a bit smaller than what we had for our main header. And then below that, we're going to have a margin bottom. And our margin bottom is going to be 60 pixels. And then underneath that margin bottom, we're going to have a margin top as well. And our margin top is going to be 20 pixels in this case. And again, these are values I played around with. So when you are building your own web pages, you will definitely play around with the CSS, especially if you're coding it from scratch. Just because we don't memorize numbers in coding, we just kind of figure out what works a lot of the time. So in this case, these are the numbers that worked for me. So that's what I'm going with. And then underneath the margin top, we're going to set a text align. So the text align again is going to be center in this case. So we'll set that to center, and then we'll save that. So now we can go back to our page and we can refresh. So now we see things are starting to come along pretty nicely, but again, we now need to focus on this little guy over here. So we need to make sure that this link is also part of the overall styling of our landing page. So the next thing we're going to go and do is we're going to add styles to our BTN. So the BTN, I believe I made that a class. Yes, I did. So notice here how this is now a class and not an ID. And, you know, it's always good to refer back because sometimes you do forget these things, right? So our class is BTN. And what we're going to do within our main CSS is we're going to use the dot like we did up here with our container. And we're going to go BTN as the name of our class. And again, we're going to use our curly braces. So I'm just scroll down for a bit there. And within our BTN, we're going to add some padding. So when you're dealing with padding, you can set it such that it goes, if you're going clockwise, you start at the top, you go to your padding right, and then you go to your padding bottom, and then you go up to your padding left. If you want to set all of those padding values in one line, you can do it such that you do it this way. So it's going to start with, I'm going to start with a value of 10 pixels, and then 50 pixels, and then 10 pixels again for my padding. So in this case, padding top is 10 pixels, padding right is 50 pixels, padding bottom is going to be 10 pixels, and then our padding left is going to be 50 pixels. So this is just a way to add some shorthand to our coding because we don't want to repeat lines, or we don't want to add extra typing. You know, it's a way to make life a little easier. So once you're done and you've ended that statement, you can move down. And our margin left, we're going to set a margin left in this case of 45%. So I'm using a percentage value just because I found that that worked better for me, but you don't have to use percentage values. You can use pixel values. You can use, M values. Like there are a few different units you can use in your CSS. These are just some examples for this basic project, but as you start learning more, you can definitely play around. So the background color of this link is going to be white. So I'll use the same hex code I've been using. And underneath that background color, we're now going to add a border radius. So border radius is basically a property that allows you to add curved edges to whatever space you're trying to style. So in this case, our BTN is defined by a square border by default, but we're now going to round those edges off using the border radius property. So that border radius, I'm going to give a value of 30 pixels. And then underneath the border radius, we're going to give a text decoration of none. And the reason why we're doing that is because notice how, I'm going to just go over to our webpage. So notice how here, if you can even see it, the Learn More link has a default styling. It's by default, it's blue. And when it's active, it becomes like a purplish color. So in this case, since I did click it, it becomes a purplish color. And underneath, there's a default underline. These are things we don't want in our BTN class. So we're eliminating those by adding a text decoration of none. So now that I've saved that, actually, I'll show you what that looks like. So we're going to refresh that. And we've actually managed. So notice here how the default color is still there, but our default underline is gone, and our button styling is now starting to take some shape. So in our CSS, in our CSS, we're going to continue, and we're actually going to add like a shadow around our button class. So notice in the demo project, I believe this is the demo project, we have a little bit of like a shadow that kind of makes it look like the button class is raised off of the page. those are some really cool effects that you'll notice, that you'll see on web pages, that kind of add a little bit of extra dimension to the styling, makes them look a little cooler, a little more professional. So that's what we're going to do on our project. Right now it's looking a little dull. It doesn't really have much oomph to it. So we're going to give that a little bit of oomph. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a property by the name of box shadow. And our box shadow is going to have some values in it that are as follows. So we're only going to box shadow 3 sides of the box, if you can imagine an invisible box. The first side is going to be 8 pixels. The second side is going to be 8 pixels. And the third side is going to be 4 pixels. Now, again, these are numbers that I played around with. You can, of course, play around with them as well for your visual fancy. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set a color. I'm going to use RGBA values again because I like that you can add opacity using the A. You can use hex codes if you want, but that makes it very solid, and then the shadow ends up looking a little weird. When you add the opacity, it makes it look a little more realistic. So within those brackets, we're going to set a 0 and a 0 and another 0, which is basically black. If we kept it at that, I'll actually show you what that looks like. So if we kept, well, if I'm using only 3, then we have to use it as an RGB. So I'm saving that, and I'm going to go and show you what that looks like. So if we refresh, now we have a shadow here. It actually doesn't look that bad. I mean, we could keep it at this if we wanted to. It's a very distinct and defined shadow, but I do like it to look a little softer and more nuanced. So I'm going to go back into our color property. I'm going to add the A, and then that allows me to add an opacity factor here. So the opacity we're going to give it is a 0.5. You can set it however you want, of course. Not set in stone, but I liked how 0.5 looked, so we're going to keep it at that. And you'll notice here how it softens a little bit. So it's a little more realistic looking, a little more shadow-like. It's not like as in your face. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to set, let me see here. We're going to set a color for our text. So underneath the color, we'll just give it a color of gray. I'm just using gray because I am a little too lazy to find a hex code for a shade of gray. So we're just going to use the basic gray, and I'm going to refresh that. So you notice here how now this button has a very grayish looking color, a little softer, and it kind of blends better with the rest of our background color scheme, which is nice. So now what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit more on our button, and what we're going to do is we're going to add some pseudo styles. Pseudo styles in CSS allow us to style links and buttons in a way that makes them a little more interactive. So we're going to give this BTN class. So we're going to define a separate set of styles on the BTN class once again. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to add a full colon, and we're going to add an active pseudo class. With our curly braces, inside of those curly braces, we can actually copy most of these styles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the styles from our BTN class. I'm going to copy those. I'm going to place them inside our active class. And there's just a couple small changes we're going to make here. Now, I did actually make a small error. We're going to go up to line 40 in our original BTN, and I'm going to make that a class, a value of 3/8 across the board. And then what we're going to do is inside of our active BTN, we're going to keep that at 4. Okay. The reason, I keep accidentally copying things. The reason is because when you refresh, so right now when I click on this, we don't really see anything. There's a slight change here, but now when we click, and I believe it may have refreshed the page for us already, so it's going to look pretty much the same. But you'll see here when you click, when you are clicked, let's say if you click and you hold your button or your mouse, there's a slight change with how the shadow looks upon the click. And that again makes it a little more realistic when the user interacts with your landing page or your call to action. It makes it look a little more realistic. So that's why we're kind of adding that active class there. So that's pretty much the active pseudo class. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to just add a hover to our button. So again, we're going to define our BTN with a hover class. And the hover class is just going to have a slight change of color. So this background color is going to be, and I picked out a hex code earlier, so I'm just going to copy that. It's going to be DFE2E6. So that is just another slightly different shade of gray. And I'm going to save that. It's a very, very subtle, well, very subtle shade of gray. And when we refresh, you don't notice a change right away, but if you do hover over this, you'll notice now we have a little hover that changes color when we hover over it like that. And when we click, it looks a little more realistic. Okay, so we could stop here if we wanted to. If you do want to continue with me, I'm actually going to add some fonts to this landing page project. So typically what I like to do is I like to go to Google Fonts, and you can, well, I actually have it in my bar here, my favorites. So you can select any font that you want. I kind of had fonts in the demo, so I'm going to go with those. But the way we do that is typically, or actually maybe I'll select some new fonts just to show you how we do this. So what we can do is we can go, I'm going to start with the main header font, and I'll select something that's a little thicker. Let me see. So Google Fonts is great. It pretty much gives you so many options to add fonts to your web page. So I could be on this for, some time, really deciding what fonts I like. But just so we're not spending too much time on this, let me see. We'll select a thicker font for the main header, or something like this seems good. So you just go here on the little plus sign, and it stores the font down here for you. So that's one font we've selected. And then for the subheading, I do like to select something a little more subtle. So in this case, we will go with this one here. And I think that should be good. So once you open that up, it shows you the ways in which you can use it depending on what your purpose is. So in this case, we start here. So this is fonts, much like style sheets, have to be connected to our CSS. Between our CSS and our HTML, we need to be able to fetch that font. Without this connection, the fonts won't load in our project. So notice here how we have our link, our href, and this link is part of the Google API that allows us to borrow these fonts from Google Fonts, and it shows you the name of the fonts that we've selected. You can select a few different fonts if you want, but keep in mind that each time you select a font, Google has to load that font into your project. So the font has to load into your project. So it could end up interfering with the quality of the load of your page. So you don't want to have too many different fonts loading at once in case you have other styles you also have to load in addition to your fonts. So I've only selected 2, and since we're only working on a small project, there shouldn't be any issue. And I've copied that, and we're going to go into our project, and we're going to go into our HTML. And inside of this head, right, so the open and closing heads, this is where we load our style sheets. So I'm going to go underneath our main style sheet we just finished creating, and I'm going to paste that, and I'm going to save that. And then the next thing you can do is actually go back into your Google Fonts, and down here it even tells you how you can specify that within your CSS. It makes it really easy for you. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to take the first font. I don't know how to pronounce that name, so I won't try, but you can literally just copy this and paste it right into your code, which makes it so easy. So we're going to go into our style sheet, and we're going to go back and select our main header. This main header will now have a font family of this font name. And just to see how that looks, again, this allows you to kind of test things out if you like them or not. totally up to you. Oh, that's the project that we used already. So in here, this is our default font. Looks like a Times New Roman. But once we save that, notice how the font now changes here. So it looks a little nicer, looks a little cooler. Now what we're going to do is we're going to style our subheader text. And we'll go back into Google Fonts and we can copy this Abel font. And I'll copy that. And within our project, we're going to go to our subheader here, and we're going to just paste that underneath our last property that we defined there. And within our project, notice how that font changes. Now, a couple things that I like to do just for myself, we can add just a couple last styles here. Oh, and one more thing actually I want to do is on the BTN, we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to paste in the same font just for consistency. We'll add that into our active class, and we'll add that into our hover class just to keep everything consistent. And when we refresh that, notice how here that font changes. It's very faint. I could make it bold if I wanted to. You can add that if you wish, but we'll just leave that as it is. And one last thing I want to do is I'm going to actually go into my subheader and we're going to add a font weight. So font weight is basically just a way to define how heavy our text is or how bold or not bold it is. So we can use bold to define if we want to make it bold. But in this case, I want to make it a little more subtle. So I'm going to use a font weight of 100. And these are just units that are given to us by CSS that we can use. And when we go back into our project, we refresh that. Notice how the font now becomes a little more faint. All right, guys, so this is the end of the project. If you've made it this far, I really do appreciate it. And this is just a project that you can kind of use for a mini portfolio if you're building that for yourself, or just for fun if you want to show your family and friends. And if you did enjoy this tutorial, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you want to see more material like this, feel free to subscribe. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your day.